She wasn't going to sit behind a cash register forever. She had dreams, big ones. And in those dreams, Jared Dicus was suddenly front and center. He came across as charming, a former football player with small-town charisma and enough edge to feel exciting. Angie was smitten. Their social media feeds became a showcase of their young love, filled with laughter, road trips, and a carefully curated intimacy for their online audience. They got married just before Angie's 21st birthday. Not everyone was convinced this was her fairy tale ending. After she said she wasn't going to get married, she gave a reason. Yes, she told me, and I asked her, but why? If she was so happy that she was going to get married. And she told me no, that the boyfriend had changed. He had become very distant. He wasn't paying attention to her, and while I advised her a lot because I'm a bit older than her, so I advised her and told her that if she didn't feel good with him, it would be better to end a relationship. According to one of her closest friends, Angie had previously been in a serious relationship with a man named Jose. She'd been planning to marry him in the US, a future that never came to be. But then she grew distant with everyone else in her life. Almost around the same time, when she met Jared, the boy she thought would save her from the misery of a mundane life. And somewhere between letting go of that past and clinging to this new love story, Angie had rewritten her future in Jared's name. It was more of a fast-forwarded romance. So much so that Jared's family didn't even fully know who Angie really was. Miss Angie, do you know what her last name was before she and brother got married? What's Angie's last name? Do you know her maiden last name? I don't know though. I don't know. Okay, how about a date of birth? Here's her phone here. Let me see her. It's all in Spanish, so here. Sorry. Fingerprints on you. Anyways. That's all you know about her. Yeah, I just know she worked over there. I know she was not here. Where'd she work? Chap ES Meat Market. The Chi. That's where I met. Yeah, and maybe that speed wasn't just about love. There were whispers that immigration concerns played a part. Angie had once been in an accident, and rumors were there that it sparked fears of deportation in Angie's mind. The timing of their wedding, just a few months into their relationship, suddenly seemed less about fairy tale endings and more about paperwork and panic. Even her friend urged her not to rush, to slow down and truly get to know Jared before binding herself to him legally and emotionally. She'd seen too many women fall into rushed, controlling relationships and suffer quietly behind closed doors. She didn't want her dearest friend to become one of them, but Angie didn't listen. Her uncle, who was a witness at her wedding, had noticed how quickly things were moving between her and Jared, and like her mother, he grew concerned. He sat her down one day and gave her the kind of advice someone gives when they've seen too much of how the world works. He told her not to make a decision out of desperation, not for papers, not for a green card, not for legal status. He was clear with her, don't marry someone just to stay in this country. And Angie insisted she loved Jared deeply, that they were doing fine and all of this was real. Her family was worried. They weren't convinced that the timing was right, and when they found out Angie and Jared were getting married, it felt like it had all happened too quickly. It was hard not to wonder if their fears were being ignored, or worse, if Angie was ignoring red flags that she couldn't or wouldn't want to see. Because not long after the wedding, the cracks in that fresh start began to show. Maybe Angie truly believed this was her fresh start, that this love, this man, this marriage could be her new beginning. A clean break from the sacrifices and hardships of her past. But whatever happiness she clung to was built on shaky ground, because while social media told one story, a blissful young couple glowing with affection, the reality was much darker. Behind the smiles, there were cracks, patterns, red flags. People close to her urged. Caution asked her to set boundaries to make sure Jared treated her with the respect she deserved. But sometimes when you're in the middle of something that feels like love, it's hard to see where adoration ends and obsession begins, and all too soon Angie would find out when it was already far too late. when Angie first introduced Jared to her circle of close friends. It was supposed to be a casual get-together, just some laughs, shared drinks, and good company. Something about it felt off even then, though no one fully grasped it at the time. They were a tight-knit group, mostly Spanish-speaking, and Angie had always fit right in that night. One of her friends brought some beers thinking it would help Jared ease into the group. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. Jared didn't speak Spanish at all. As the conversations flowed in a language he couldn't understand, frustration began to flicker across his face. And trying to bridge the gap, kept translating back and forth. Her friend noticed how tense she got, always looking to Jared as if checking whether he was okay, whether he was angry. They started calling him Rojo Red for his hair. It was a light-hearted nickname among friends. But Jared didn't laugh along. He didn't smile. He sat stiffly, disconnected, and sometimes without saying a word, he'd just leave. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. What seemed like awkwardness at first, in hindsight began to look a lot more like resentment. Jared wasn't just irritated that he couldn't follow the conversations. He was alienated. He felt like an outsider around Angie's people in her world, and the way he handled that wasn't with curiosity or patience. It was with cold detachment, maybe even simmering anger. After the wedding, things got worse. Angie's friend remembered the shift, how Jared's discomfort turned into distance, how he stopped making any effort. The gatherings became fewer. The joy dimmed. Angie became quieter, and when she did show up, she never really seemed fully there. Looking back, her friend could trace the moment the light in Angie's eyes started to fade. The pressure of trying to make two worlds fit together was falling squarely on Angie's shoulders, and she was doing all she could to keep it from breaking. But sometimes the cracks are too deep to hide. As 2023 rolled in, Jared Douglas was unraveling fast. By November, his volatility had reached dangerous heights. He'd been arrested for driving while intoxicated, after causing a scene at a local restaurant, shouting, acting aggressively toward the staff. When police arrived, they found him belligerent, punching windows. He was so out of control, they had to strap him into a restraint chair just to draw a blood sample. It wasn't just alcohol. The police suspected meth was coursing through his veins. By January, Jared was out on bond, but nothing about him had stabilized behind closed doors. Angie was growing more and more afraid. She asked Jared's mother Lynn directly that Jared stopped sleeping in the same house as her. In the final week of her life, Jared had started asking to move back in with his parents. Into the house. He just spent money fixing up for him and Angie. Why no one could quite understand. But it was clear he didn't want to be in that house with Angie anymore. And maybe Angie didn't want him there either. You know, things are serious when your boss notices it too. Ruth Almanaz had worked closely with Angie at the meat market. To her, Angie wasn't just an employee, she was like a daughter. The two shared a quiet closeness built over time. Ruth had seen her through cheerful mornings, long shifts, and bursts of laughter behind the counter. And it was at this very counter where Angie had first met Jared. But things changed after the wedding. Slowly at first, Angie, once so warm and full of light, started retreating into herself. She grew quieter, more nervous. She wasn't as quick to smile, and she was always looking over her shoulder. Jared had started showing up at the market too often, just standing there looking for her, hovering around the counter. It made people uncomfortable. Then came Tuesday, January 10th, the day before Angie's murder. Ruth walked in around the early afternoon and immediately sensed something was off. Her staff flagged her down, urging her to talk to Angie. At first, she assumed it was a work-related issue, maybe a customer complaint or a mistake, but they said no. It was more serious than that. Angie didn't look well. Her eyes were distant. Her energy drained. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, someone carrying too much. Ruth pulled her aside, gently asking what had happened. That's when she noticed it. A bruise on Angie's shoulder, and not the kind you get from bumping into a door. This was something else. Another coworker. Erica joined them in the back kitchen together. They sat with Angie for a few quiet minutes. That's when she opened up. She told them she was planning to leave Jared. Maybe not one day. She was sure. She told both of us that she was leaving him and that she would never get married again. I asked her, was it really that bad? Has it been that terrible for you? Why? That's when I got closer, lifted her shirt a little, and told her, you can't let this keep happening. And then Angie said something else, things that went beyond just hitting. She told Ruth they had been arguing all night, which Ruth would later tell to the cops. That Sunday, Angie had gone to the movies with her aunt. Just a simple outing, something completely normal for her, but Jared hadn't wanted her to go. He didn't want her seeing anyone, didn't want her to have even a sliver of independence. When she got back home that night, it all exploded. Jared kept her up all night, refusing to let her sleep. Angie looked drained when she showed up at work the next morning, pale, hollow-eyed, like someone who had been pushed far past the edge. And then as she tried to shower and get ready for the day, the argument escalated. And then Ruth would tell the officer that Jared had assaulted Angie while she was in the shower. It wasn't a matter of if anymore. Angie had been living in fear, and now it was written across her body. As Ruth gently pressed, Angie confessed even more. This wasn't just one fight. This wasn't a bad night. It was a pattern, and she was ready to break it. She told Ruth she had made up her mind. She told Ruth that it was time to leave. Angie didn't tell Jared she was moving out. Not exactly, but she did tell him that she wasn't going to keep living that way. She wasn't going to tolerate the control, the fear, the violence. It was the first real declaration of her intent to escape. But what no one knew then was that this small act of resistance, this whisper of freedom, might have been what sealed her fate. And when Angie paused while telling the horrors she had faced, Ruth put a stop to the conversation. Saving it for later, they made plans to talk again. Angie had Friday off and told Ruth she wanted to go for coffee somewhere quiet away from the market where she could finally say everything without people overhearing, but that coffee never happened. Tuesday was the last time Ruth saw her alive. After the murder, Ruth checked the security footage, desperate to find proof of that final conversation. The cameras had captured them talking at the register, but there was no sound, no microphone. Just a silent video of a young woman bruised and broken, sharing what she could before she ran out of time, and that silence would haunt Ruth forever. Then on the night of January 8th, just 3 days before Angie's murder, something unsettling happened at nearly midnight. Jared made a strange call to 911. He was disoriented, paranoid, and barely coherent in a shaky voice. He claimed he'd taken drugs and needed help. He didn't seem sure of anything, not where he was, not what he had taken, not why he even called, but he did ask for an ambulance. Paramedics were dispatched immediately, but just a few minutes later, Jared called again, still confused, still mumbling about feeling unwell, unsure whether he meant what he said. It was clear something had altered his state of mind, something strong. When the medics arrived, they transported him to the hospital where it was confirmed. Jared had been using methamphetamine. It was a devastating blow to his family. Jared's older brother had struggled with meth for years, tearing their family apart in the process, but Jared had never been that kid. He was the other son, the one who stayed away from the actions that would put his parents down, or so they thought. Jared had admitted to his parents briefly, and in passing, that he'd taken meth only to deny it. Moments later, he flipped between admissions and deflections. 1 second, he was crying. The next, he was lying. The moments between might be uneventful for those who did not witness what happened between this couple. It became evident on January 11th how deep trouble ran through in those days. It was a Wednesday morning, quiet, uneventful, and eerily still, but the silence was about to be shattered. Jared had returned to his home around 4 a.m. after what seemed to be a typical shift. His house, nestled in the back of his parents' property, sat dark and isolated. He slipped inside without much notice. No one saw him again for several hours. It wasn't until 12:30 p.m. that his mother, Lynn, caught sight of him again. He came back into their house, but something was off. He seemed nervous, unfocused, and then she heard it, a phone ringing. Not his usual ringtone, not even his usual phone. It was a device she didn't recognize. Curious and concerned, Lynn questioned him about the unfamiliar phone. Jared casually claimed to have multiple phones, but the story didn't sit right. Something about the device, the look, the feel. It wasn't his. And when he finally pulled it from his pocket, the screen was in Spanish. That's when Lynn's heart dropped. She knew immediately. This was Angie's phone. Angie, who never left her phone behind. Angie, who had been growing increasingly distant and afraid. Who just days earlier had been bruised and exhausted from yet another sleepless, violent night. Lynn didn't wait. She bolted out of the house with her husband Rodney, heading straight toward Jared and Angie's home. Deep down, she already feared the worst. There was only one entrance. The front door. As they pushed it open, a wave of darkness met them. At first they couldn't see anything, but with a single step inside, Rodney froze. What he saw would haunt him in his sleep forever. He turned to his wife and told her not to come in, but it was too late. Lynn stepped inside and saw the horror for herself. Angie's lifeless body lay inside her young face. Once vibrant, was now still brutally silenced. Panic set in. Lynn fumbled with her phone, unable to think, unable to act. Rodney grabbed it from her and made the call, not just to report a death, but to report their own son, the boy they'd raised. The man who had once promised to protect Angie, now suspected of ending her life. Lynn would then brief the officer about her son's issues. Okay, and he has been acting really strange lately. Okay, he called an ambulance on his cell the other night. Okay, and said he was on drugs, but I don't believe that he was. I think something's wrong. Okay, because, I don't know, we don't have the labs from the hospital, so I really don't know the answer to that. The police were called, and when they arrived, there was no question who they would arrest. Jared had been the last person with her. He was in possession of her phone. He had a documented history of violent outbursts and drug use. And Angie had told those closest to her that she didn't feel safe anymore. This, according to investigators, was the final tragic act in a toxic, unraveling relationship. A young woman who wanted out, and a man who couldn't bear to lose control. Jared was taken into custody, but that was only the beginning. The interrogation tapes would reveal even more unsettling truths about what really happened between Jared and Angie. Because when police sat Jared down and started asking questions, after, you just told me before, why did you put her head in the bathtub? You told me her hair was wet. How come? Did you turn the shower on? Yes. To wash herself, or to wash her hanger, or what to wash her? At first, Jared dissociated himself from the situation. Then he cracked under pressure, telling the officers that he had used the same knife against his wife that she took out for her herself, defense against him. In the months that followed Angie's death, the case against Jared Douglas moved swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming. His erratic behavior, the bruises Angie had tried to explain away, the phone in his pocket that wasn't his, and most damning of all, the scene inside their home. Prosecutors argued that this was no sudden outburst. It was the tragic culmination of months of escalating violence fueled by substance abuse control and a refusal to let Angie leave. Jared's defense tried to shift the narrative, claiming he'd only used meth once, that he was confused, overwhelmed, not in his right mind, but the jury didn't buy it. On July 31st, the trial came to a close. Jared Douglas was sentenced to 40 years in prison, for decades behind bars for the brutal murder of Angie, for Angie's family and friends. The sentencing brought some sense of justice. No sentence, no number of years could ever bring her back. The young woman who dreamed of freedom, who was trying to find the courage to start over, had her life stolen before she ever got the chance. How many more women have to die after asking for help before someone listens in time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching. Angie Diaz was a beautiful young woman, a sweet wife, and a loving daughter. But from what you just heard on that phone call, she would soon be found dead with her head savagely separated from her body. You can't even keep it straight, buddy. The man who just laughed while her murder is being interrogated is her own husband. The one who promised the world to her, but then snatched her whole life away. I got as far, Sergeant. I got as far as the doorway. I didn't go. Yeah, don't go on. This is a murder scene. Decapitation. It's an ugly, ugly spot. Beyond before this horrific scene. Just 3 months earlier, Angie and Jared had stood side by side, grinning in their wedding photos full of hope and plans for the future. A new marriage, a fresh start. Everything would seem right a few months down the line, but what happened between I do and I killed? How could Jared do this to his beloved wife? And more importantly, why did this even happen? Before January 11th, 2023, everything seemed normal, at least from the outside. Angie Diaz was described by those who knew her as endlessly kind, always smiling and full of warmth. Her co-workers adored her. Her absence was now already devastating. Tears would roll down her loved one's eyes when they told the media how dearly they would miss her. Now the nightmare had unfolded in the rural outskirts of Magnolia, Texas, a peaceful community known for magnolia trees and small-town charm, where violent crime was nearly unheard of until now. The first medic on the scene paused, unsure whether they were walking into a suicide, an accident, or something else entirely. As he stepped inside, a realization hit. They weren't there to save a life anymore. Angie was gone and decapitated. Blake said her head is somewhere else in the tub. Okay, I gotta wait to CID to get here. Okay. And her head was mercilessly dumped in the bathtub. The living room floor was soaked in blood. Cigarette butts were scattered around the body. Bloodstained clothes were tossed carelessly nearby. This wasn't just a killing, it was rage. It was personal. It was deliberate. What happened in that house between two people who once vowed forever, and what drove Jared Dykes to commit one of the most brutal acts in recent Texas memory. In fact, if anything, people might have pointed fingers at his older brother Wayne. He had long battled meth addiction and had tangled with the law more than once. Starting back in 2018 when he was only 20. Jared, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the quiet one. He played football in high school, held a steady job as an electrician, and had a reputation for looking out for his troubled brother. He'd even called the police on Wayne once for stealing copper wire, though he'd later expressed regret. Now, Jared had lived in the Houston area all his life. There was nothing about his background that hinted at the horror he would eventually unleash, but perhaps the cracks were there. Small fractures waiting to split wide open. Then came Angie. Their paths crossed in 2022 at Cheap's Meat Market where Angie worked as a cashier. A chance meeting that turned into a whirlwind romance to outsiders. It looked like fate. They moved fast, too fast, and by October of that year, they were married. Angie Diaz had her own story born in Nicaragua in October 2001. She was raised by a single mother who often left the children in the care of relatives while working in Costa Rica to support them. Angie was smart, driven, and deeply loyal to her family. She studied accounting at the National Autonomous University of Nicaragua at Leon and was known for her work ethic and maturity beyond her years. Life took a sudden turn when her aunt, the woman who had raised her like a daughter, was diagnosed with cancer. That's when her biological mother, now in the U.S., paid smugglers to bring Angie and her siblings across the Mexican border. They arrived undocumented, seeking hope in a place that promised more than what they'd left behind. Angie quickly found work at the meat market and began promoting herself online as a personal trainer. Her posts brimmed with optimism and resilience. Reminders to celebrate your own victories because no one else truly knows what it took to earn them. But not everyone shared her urgency. Her mother, cautious and protective, told her to have patience, reminding her that things would come with time. Finances were tight, but Angie didn't want to wait.